Surrender your battles to the Lord. He turns your pain into breakthrough. You are fighting battles that were never assigned to your strength. That realization does not arrive gently. It lands like a sudden break in the noise inside you. A split second of clarity revealing that the weight you have been carrying was never meant to rest entirely on your shoulders. Something in you knows this is true. Something deep, quiet, almost hidden, has been trying to say it for longer than you admit. That inner voice has been whispering beneath the exhaustion, beneath the frustration, beneath the moments where you felt stretched past your limits. It has been trying to show you that the battle is not just difficult, it is misaligned. And misalignment always creates pressure. Think about the way your mind has been functioning lately. You have been analyzing every angle, anticipating every outcome, rehearsing every possible failure. Your thoughts have multiplied without bringing you closer to a solution. Your emotions have been pulled tight, as if the internal wiring of your heart were being stretched by a force you cannot control. Your spirit has tried to stay centered, yet the fight has pushed it to the edge of its endurance. If you pause long enough, you can sense that your inner world has been carrying a battle with no clear endpoint. The heaviness you feel is not the weight of the situation itself. It is the weight of believing you must resolve it alone. Descartes taught that clarity begins when the mind isolates what can be trusted from what must be questioned. Apply that principle inward. Ask yourself whether the pressure pressing against your thoughts is truly coming from the battle, or from the belief that you are responsible for every outcome. The moment you question that belief, something shifts. You begin to see that the burden you are carrying is not just physical or emotional. It is structural. It is the structure of a heart that has taken on responsibilities too great for human strength. And when that structure is overloaded, the inner world begins to collapse under its own expectations. There comes a moment when the soul signals that enough is enough. It might be through fatigue you cannot explain. It might show up through irritability that surprises you. It might appear through a sudden wave of discouragement that catches you off guard. These are not signs of weakness. They are signals of misalignment. They indicate that the weight inside you has reached a threshold, that the battle you are fighting has expanded beyond the limits of your capacity. You may think you are failing. In truth, your heart is telling you that the battle never belonged solely to you in the first place. If you look closer, you will notice that pain has been trying to deliver a message. Not the message of defeat, but the message that the battle as you are fighting it is unsustainable. Pain is not proof that you are losing. Pain is proof that you are carrying something you were meant to surrender. Pain becomes sharpest when the soul is working against its design. You were created to fight with God, not instead of Him. And the moment you attempt to carry the full weight of a battle that requires divine intervention, pain increases to reveal that your heart is out of alignment with the source of its strength. You may have convinced yourself that pushing harder is the only solution, that if you can analyze more, endure more, perform more, or control more, the breakthrough will finally come. But battles do not break by intensity alone. They break when the weight shifts from your hands to God's. Breakthrough begins at the exact point where your strength ends and His begins. Yet many people never reach breakthrough because they never reach surrender. They keep fighting in their own power, convinced that letting go would mean losing. They do not realize that surrender is the moment God steps into the territory you have been trying to defend alone. Consider how much energy you have used trying to hold everything together. Consider how many nights you have spent replaying the same fears. Consider how many moments of silence have been filled with worry instead of rest. If the battle were truly yours to win alone, that effort would have produced clarity by now. Instead, it has produced tension. That tension is the evidence that God is calling you to release the fight. Not because He wants to take something from you, but because He wants to take something off of you. The introduction of this video is not meant to soothe you. It is meant to awaken you. It is meant to bring you to the realization that your battle is not ending because you are still fighting it in the wrong position. You were never meant to stand in the center of this fight. You were meant to stand behind the one who fights for you. And the moment you understand that, everything inside you begins to shift. The weight lightens. The pressure decreases. The path ahead becomes clearer, not because the battle has changed, but because your position within it has. This is where breakthrough begins. The moment you see that the battle is not yours alone is the moment your heart becomes ready to lay it down. And once that happens, God begins to turn your pain into the very breakthrough you have been longing for. The hidden weight theory. There is a type of heaviness that does not come from circumstances but from the invisible load a person places on their own shoulders. It is the weight of believing that the outcome depends entirely on you. This weight grows silently. It begins with small assumptions about responsibility, then expands into a personal expectation that you must control what is uncontrollable, predict what is unpredictable, and carry what only God can transform. The hidden weight theory reveals that the true burden of your battle lies not in the battle itself, but in the responsibility you believe you must uphold. If you observe your thoughts carefully, you will notice that the pressure you feel is not proportional to the situation. It is proportional to the sense of responsibility you have attached to it. When the heart assumes ownership of what belongs to God, the internal weight multiplies. When the mind tries to manage outcomes that only He can rearrange, tension becomes unavoidable. And when the soul tries to fight in isolation, it becomes exhausted long before the battle ever concludes. This exhaustion is not a sign of failure. It is evidence of misalignment between human limits and divine design. Descartes wrote that the mind often deceives itself by forming ideas that feel certain but are built on false assumptions. One of the strongest false assumptions a person carries is the belief that they must be strong enough to fix everything. This assumption creates a structure inside the mind where every detail becomes a threat, every outcome becomes a test, and every delay becomes a personal flaw. The heart becomes overburdened, not because the situation is too heavy, but because the person has taken responsibility for what was never theirs. This hidden weight alters perception. It makes simple decisions feel complex. It makes small setbacks feel catastrophic. It turns uncertainty into fear and turns the unknown into a source of anxiety. When the heart carries responsibility beyond its capacity, the internal world becomes disordered. Thoughts lose their clarity. Emotions lose their balance. Discernment becomes clouded. The person feels trapped not by the battle, but by the pressure of believing they must win it alone. The hidden weight also affects how you interpret pain. When you believe the burden is yours, pain becomes a personal indictment. You begin to think the pain means you are inadequate, incapable, or unprepared. Yet the truth is far simpler. Pain grows when the heart carries what it was never designed to hold. The discomfort is not a result of weakness. It is a natural consequence of misalignment. You are feeling the strain of responsibilities that exceed the limits of human strength. And that strain is calling you to release what you have been gripping too tightly. Look at the moments when your chest feels heavy, when your thoughts feel crowded, when your emotions feel unstable. In each of those moments, the weight inside you has increased because your heart has picked up what belongs to the Lord. You have stepped into a role you were never meant to fill. You have taken ownership of outcomes God has already seen, measured, and prepared. The hidden weight theory shows that your pressure is not proof that the situation is impossible. It is proof that your heart is carrying a responsibility it needs to surrender. This weight does not decrease through effort. It decreases through release. No amount of thinking, planning, or resisting will lighten it. The hidden weight only lifts when the heart acknowledges that the battle belongs to God. When you shift responsibility back into His hands, your inner world begins to reorder itself. Thoughts regain clarity. Emotions regain balance. Discernment sharpens. Peace returns. The battle may remain the same, but the burden no longer rests on you. The hidden weight theory does not minimize your struggle. It clarifies it. It shows you that the heaviness you feel is not a measure of your weakness, but a sign that your heart is carrying the wrong assignment. Once you recognize that, the path to surrender becomes clearer. Surrender is not an escape. It is correction. It restores responsibility to its rightful place. And as the weight shifts, something profound happens inside you. You begin to feel lighter, not because the situation has changed, but because your soul has been realigned with the one who carries what you cannot. This insight prepares you for the next truth. If pain is increasing, it may not be signaling defeat. It may be signaling misalignment. And misalignment can be corrected the moment the heart returns responsibility to God. The pain interpretation shift. Pain is one of the most misunderstood signals in the human experience. People often assume that when pain rises, defeat is approaching. They believe pain is the measurement of failure, the confirmation of weakness, or the sign that God is distant. Yet pain, when understood correctly, becomes one of the most accurate indicators of spiritual misalignment. Pain increases not because you are losing. Pain increases because your soul is fighting a battle it was never meant to fight alone. When the heart moves outside the territory of surrender, pain becomes the messenger calling it back. Consider the way pain behaves inside you. It rarely begins loud. It begins subtly, as tension in your thoughts, as pressure beneath your ribs, or as an uneasiness you cannot explain. When the heart tries to control what it cannot control, pain grows sharper. When the mind tries to predict what only God can orchestrate, pain becomes heavier. When your spirit attempts to stand alone under a weight designed for divine partnership, pain becomes unavoidable. It is not the enemy. It is the signal. It alerts you that something internal is attempting to operate without the strength it requires. Descartes taught that confusion arises when the mind mixes clear ideas with unclear ones. Pain appears when the soul mixes divine responsibility with human responsibility. The confusion creates inner conflict. The conflict creates strain, and strain becomes pain. The moment you try to carry what belongs to God, the internal structure begins to weaken. Pain reveals that weakening. It does not condemn you. It guides you. It points to the area where surrender is necessary. It identifies the exact place where you are misaligned with the path God prepared for you. Pain also exposes the difference between fighting in your strength and standing in His. When you fight in your strength, pain intensifies as you push harder. When you stand in His strength, pain shifts into purpose. It does not disappear immediately. Instead, it transforms. The same pressure that once overwhelmed you becomes pressure that shapes you. Pain becomes structured rather than chaotic. It becomes directional rather than destructive. It becomes an internal sign that God is preparing breakthrough rather than signaling collapse. If you examine your life, you will notice that the seasons of greatest pain were often the seasons where you felt most alone in the fight. You believed you needed to carry the outcome. You convinced yourself you had to force a solution. You assumed that surrender would be irresponsible. Yet every attempt to hold the battle in your own hands only increased the tension inside you. Pain was not punishing you. Pain was warning you. It was trying to stop you from exhausting yourself in a fight that God was waiting to take over. Pain shifts the moment you reinterpret it. When you stop seeing pain as proof of failure and start seeing it as evidence of misalignment, everything changes. You no longer panic when you feel pressured. You begin asking different questions. Where am I carrying something I need to release? Where am I assuming responsibility that belongs to God? Where have I stepped outside the posture of surrender? Pain becomes the roadmap to correction. It leads you back to the place where the burden can be lifted. The pain interpretation shift also affects how you view your future. Fear tells you that pain means the situation is falling apart. Truth tells you that pain means the situation is too heavy for you alone. Fear insists that pain is a dead end. Truth reveals that pain is a turning point. You are not being crushed. You are being redirected. You are being invited to lay down a battle that has become too large for you to manage. The moment you stop misinterpreting pain, the moment you stop assuming it means God is absent, you begin to see that pain is actually drawing you back to Him. When pain is understood correctly, it becomes the catalyst for surrender. The heart begins to realize that breakthrough does not come from resisting the pressure. Breakthrough comes from releasing the pressure into God's hands. Pain becomes the doorway through which surrender walks. It reminds you that you were not designed to operate independently of Him. It reminds you that every battle has a spiritual structure, and that structure cannot hold when the heart tries to occupy God's role. The pain interpretation shift prepares the soul for transformation, because once you recognize that pain is not your enemy, you become willing to stop resisting. And the moment resistance stops, surrender begins. And where surrender begins, breakthrough follows. The resistance spiral. There is a moment in every internal battle where pressure begins multiplying faster than your ability to manage it. You feel it in the tightening of your thoughts, in the narrowing of your emotional space, in the way your mind circles the same worries without finding resolution. This is the resistance spiral. It forms the moment your heart chooses resistance instead of surrender. Resistance may feel like strength in the beginning, but it becomes a trap that intensifies the very pain you are trying to escape. The resistance spiral begins when you interpret your struggle as something you must push through, rather than something you must release. The more you resist, the more energy you invest in fighting the moment instead of navigating it. That energy creates strain. The strain becomes tension. The tension becomes exhaustion. And exhaustion becomes discouragement. Discouragement then triggers more resistance, and the cycle tightens. Each turn of the spiral adds pressure to your inner world, making clarity harder to access and peace harder to feel. Resistance promises control, but it delivers collapse. Descartes believed that the mind often becomes trapped in false perceptions when it attempts to solve a problem with the same reasoning that created the confusion. The resistance spiral follows this exact pattern. You attempt to regain control using the very thoughts that led you into chaos. You try to stabilize yourself with assumptions shaped by fear. You attempt to find solutions inside a mental environment already distorted by pressure. This creates a loop where every attempt to fix the situation deepens the internal instability. Thought fights thought. Emotion fights emotion. Spirit fights exhaustion. Nothing aligns. Everything strains. The resistance spiral affects perception by shrinking your world. When you resist, your focus narrows to the immediate pressure. Your mind exaggerates worst-case scenarios. Your emotions amplify imagined threats. Your spirit becomes overshadowed by internal noise. You lose access to perspective. The horizon becomes blurred. Possibilities become invisible. You begin interpreting every uncertainty as danger and every delay as failure. Resistance keeps your attention trapped in the problem instead of allowing you to see the presence of God surrounding the problem. This spiral also convinces you that if you stop resisting, everything will fall apart. It tells you that rest is dangerous. It tells you that slowing down is irresponsible. It tells you that surrender is equivalent to defeat. Yet the truth is far simpler. Resistance is the creator of the chaos you fear. You are not protecting yourself by resisting. You are overwhelming yourself by fighting battles that require divine intervention. The more you resist, the further you drift from the only source of strength capable of carrying the weight you are trying to manage. The spiral intensifies because resistance blocks the flow of clarity. Clarity cannot enter a mind that is braced against every possibility. Clarity cannot enter a heart that is attempting to predict every outcome. Clarity cannot enter a spirit that is tense from self-reliance. The moment resistance forms, clarity fades. And when clarity fades, fear rushes in to fill the empty space. Fear grows louder each time resistance tightens. It begins shaping your decisions, your reactions, and your expectations. What began as a moment of pressure becomes a state of inner captivity. But the resistance spiral is not permanent. It can be interrupted instantly. The interruption does not come from effort. It comes from surrender. The moment you stop resisting, the internal pressure begins to unwind. Thoughts loosen, emotions steady, breath returns. The mind regains enough quiet to perceive truth. The heart regains enough space to feel the presence of God. The spirit regains enough strength to stand again without collapsing under the weight of imagined responsibility. Surrender cuts the spiral at its root because surrender breaks the illusion that everything depends on you. The resistance spiral teaches a profound spiritual truth. You cannot fight your way into breakthrough through force. Breakthrough comes when you stop resisting the process God is trying to lead you through. The battle that feels impossible is often the one you have tried hardest to control. When you release control, you break the cycle. When you stop resisting, you stop feeding the fear that grows within the spiral. And once the spiral weakens, God can begin the work you have been praying for all along. Understanding the resistance spiral prepares your heart for the next revelation. Surrender is not losing ground. Surrender is making space. And that space is exactly where God begins to turn pain into breakthrough. The divine displacement principle. There is a spiritual law at work in every internal battle, yet most people never recognize it. It is the divine displacement principle. This principle reveals that surrender is not about giving up. It is about creating space. When you let go of a battle you were never designed to carry, God does not leave the space empty. He fills it. His presence occupies the very territory where fear once ruled. His strength settles into the places where your strength was collapsing. His clarity replaces the confusion that had been tightening around your mind. Divine displacement occurs when your release becomes God's entry point. Think of your heart as a room with limited capacity. When fear occupies that room, it expands until no space remains for clarity or peace. When control occupies that room, it fills every corner with pressure and expectation. When anxiety occupies that room, it suffocates your ability to perceive direction. These forces grow not because they are powerful, but because the heart is crowded. The problem is not the size of the battle. The problem is the lack of space within you. The more you try to handle everything yourself, the more the internal room becomes consumed. The principle becomes clear. As long as fear and self-responsibility fill the heart, God's peace has no place to settle. Descartes wrote about the need to remove unreliable ideas to make room for truth. The divine displacement principle aligns perfectly with this logic. You cannot receive God's guidance while clinging to assumptions shaped by fear. You cannot receive His strength while holding on to the belief that everything depends on you. You cannot receive His breakthrough while maintaining control of the outcome. Incorrect ideas must be removed for correct ones to take root. God does not compete with what is overwhelming you. He waits for displacement. He waits for surrender to clear the space that only He can fill. This principle becomes visible when a person reaches the limit of their strength. They feel the collapse. They feel the exhaustion. They feel the emotional and spiritual strain pressing against their ability to cope. They assume it means they are failing, but the truth is far deeper. The collapse is not failure. It is preparation. It is the moment where the internal structure can no longer support the weight it has been carrying, creating the perfect opening for divine displacement. God steps into your weakness not to expose it, but to inhabit it. He turns the empty space into a foundation for breakthrough. Divine displacement also reveals why surrender is so transformative. When you release your grip on the battle, you are not losing anything essential. You are losing what has been harming you. You are losing the pressure that has been distorting your perception. You are losing the anxiety that has been tightening around your thoughts. You are losing the illusion that you must be the one to fix everything. As these internal forces lose their position, God takes their place. Peace enters where fear had rooted itself. Clarity enters where confusion had settled. Strength enters where exhaustion had taken hold. The moment something harmful is displaced, something holy is installed. This principle also teaches you that God does not fill the heart partially. When you surrender, He fills completely. He does not enter only the large problems and ignore the small ones. He steps into the very details that have been creating tension inside you. He addresses the subtle fears you have not spoken aloud. He lifts the burdens you have not admitted to anyone. He reorganizes the internal world that had been collapsing under its own weight. Divine displacement is comprehensive. It restores order to every part of the heart that has been affected by the battle. One of the most profound aspects of this principle is that God will not force His way into a crowded heart. He waits for the invitation that only surrender can give. He waits for the moment when the heart decides that resisting is too costly and holding on is too heavy. The moment the heart releases space, God fills it. He does not hesitate. He does not delay. He enters the room of your inner world and begins aligning every thought, healing every wound and stabilizing every emotion that had been shaking under pressure. What you release becomes the very area where He works most powerfully. The divine displacement principle prepares you for a deeper truth. Surrender is not the end of the battle. It is the beginning of God's intervention. And once He steps into the space you have cleared, the path to breakthrough becomes inevitable. Sacred descent into trust. Trust does not emerge from strength. Trust emerges from surrender. It is not born in moments when everything feels secure. It is born in the moments when your inner world can no longer sustain the weight of self-reliance. The sacred descent into trust begins when the heart recognizes that holding the battle has become more damaging than the battle itself. It is the moment when you stop fighting to maintain control and begin allowing God to step into the space your resistance once occupied. This descent is not a fall. It is a lowering of defenses. It is the deliberate choice to release what has been crushing you from the inside. Trust cannot enter a rigid heart. When the heart is clenched around fear, the internal environment becomes too tight for truth to settle. When the mind is spinning with imagined outcomes, trust cannot take root. When emotions are braced against disappointment, trust cannot breathe. The descent into trust begins by loosening this inner rigidity. It begins by questioning the belief that everything depends on you. It begins by acknowledging that resisting the battle has only deepened your exhaustion. Descartes taught that clarity comes when the mind strips away assumptions that distort reality. Trust grows in the same way. It begins when you strip away the assumption that you are alone in this fight. This descent is sacred because it requires honesty. You must confront the places within you that have been pretending to be strong. You must confront the pressure you have been hiding from others. You must confront the fears you have been trying to reason your way around. The descent into trust invites these hidden experiences into the light. It does not judge them. It names them. And by naming them, it weakens their influence. A heart that acknowledges its limits becomes a heart capable of receiving strength, not based on its own capacity, but on God's. There is a shift that occurs when trust begins to form. Panic loses its grip. The urgency that once dictated your thoughts begins to slow. The inner noise softens enough for truth to enter. You start to recognize that surrender is not a passive action. It is a strategic one. It aligns you with the only strength capable of carrying the battle to completion. It positions you under the covering of a God who has already seen the outcome. Trust is not blind. Trust is the recognition that you can safely release what you were never equipped to hold. Many people fear surrender because they believe it leads to vulnerability. In reality, surrender leads to reinforcement. When you descend into trust, you are not becoming weaker. You are stepping into a structure stronger than any you could build on your own. You exchange the instability of your own efforts for the stability of God's sovereignty. You trade uncertainty for divine clarity. You trade exhaustion for supernatural strength. This descent is sacred because it is transformative. It reorganizes the foundation of your inner world, replacing fear-driven instincts with faith-driven alignment. Trust changes the interpretation of your battle. Instead of seeing chaos, you begin to see timing. Instead of seeing obstacles, you begin to see redirection. Instead of seeing delays as setbacks, you begin to see them as protection. Trust opens your perception to a reality you could not access while resisting. It is the shift from reacting to responding. It is the shift from fear to clarity. It is the shift from carrying burdens to releasing them. When trust settles into the heart, the battle no longer feels like a threat. It becomes a process God is guiding, shaping, and leading toward breakthrough. This descent also prepares you emotionally for breakthrough. When fear is displaced by trust, the heart softens enough to receive what God has been holding for you. Breakthrough does not arrive in a tense heart. It requires openness. It requires readiness. It requires the ability to release the old way of fighting so that God can introduce a new one. Trust becomes the gateway. It signals that your inner world has shifted from striving to surrender, from resistance to partnership, from self-reliance to divine reliance. The sacred descent into trust prepares the soul for prayer. It brings the heart into a posture where it can finally release the battle and allow God to perform the exchange that transforms pain into breakthrough. Main prayer. Release, exchange, breakthrough. Lord, we come before you carrying burdens that have pressed against the deepest places of our hearts. We bring the weight we have held in silence, the tension that has stretched our strength, the worries that have crowded our thoughts, and the fears that have shaped our expectations. We bring every hidden battle, every unspoken concern, and every moment where we tried to stand in our own power and felt ourselves weakening. We release these to you now, not because we are giving up, but because we recognize that holding them has been breaking us from the inside. We release the urge to control what we cannot control. We release the fear that has been dictating our decisions. We release the anxiety that has wrapped itself around our thoughts. We release the expectation that we must be strong enough to carry every responsibility. We release the outcomes we have been trying to predict. We release the belief that everything depends on our ability to solve what only you can transform. Lord, let this release become the clearing of space inside us. Let this release become the moment where your presence enters and begins to reorder what fear has disorganized. Now we exchange. We place into your hands every burden that has been draining our strength, and we receive what you place in return. Where there was fear, let there now be peace. Where there was confusion, let there now be clarity. Where there was pressure, let there now be stillness. Where there was exhaustion, let there now be renewed strength. Where there was self-reliance, let there now be divine partnership. Fill the empty spaces with what only you can provide. Fill the places where fear once settled. Fill the places where anxiety once lived. Fill the places where doubt once whispered. Replace everything harmful with everything holy. Exchange our weakness for your strength. Exchange our striving for your guidance. Exchange our uncertainty for your wisdom. Exchange our tension for your order. Let this exchange become the foundation upon which breakthrough is built. Let this exchange signal that the battle no longer rests in our hands. Let this be the moment where responsibility shifts back into the hands of the one who has never been threatened by the battles that overwhelm us. Let the internal weight lift as your strength settles into the places that were collapsing under pressure. Now, Lord, begin the breakthrough, not as an event that erupts suddenly, but as a shift that begins within. Breakthrough starts when your presence enters the spaces we released. It begins when your voice becomes louder than our fears. It begins when the heart stops resisting and starts cooperating with your guidance. Breakthrough is the restructuring of our inner world through your truth. It is the return of clarity, the rise of peace, the strengthening of courage, and the restoration of direction. Begin this work now. Let your breakthrough enter the places where pain had been accumulating. Let your breakthrough touch the areas of our lives we thought were beyond repair. Break through the limits we placed on ourselves. Break through the assumptions that held us back. Break through the lies that shaped our perception. Break through the emotional patterns that kept us trapped in cycles of fear. Let your breakthrough push out the remnants of burden that surrender has removed. Let it realign every thought, every emotion, and every expectation. Let it transform the way we see the battle, not by changing the circumstances first, but by changing us within them. Lord, let this breakthrough become permanent. Let it reshape our inner structure so deeply that we no longer return to self-reliance. Let it anchor our trust, strengthen our resolve, and steady our steps. Let it remind us that the battles we surrender become the battles you win. Let this breakthrough mark the moment where our pain begins its transformation into purpose. Let it mark the moment where our weakness becomes the place where your power rests. Let it mark the moment where our surrender becomes the doorway to everything you have prepared. We release, we exchange, we receive breakthrough. And as we do, Lord, take your place at the center of our hearts, where fear once stood. Let your presence be the foundation upon which we continue walking forward. The breakthrough mechanism. Breakthrough is often imagined as a sudden event, a dramatic shift where everything changes in an instant. Yet the true nature of breakthrough is much more intricate and far more personal. Breakthrough is not the moment circumstances transform. Breakthrough is the moment you transform. It begins inside the structure of your inner world, long before you see evidence of change in your outer world. Breakthrough is not created by force. It is created by alignment. It is the alignment of your spirit with God's timing, your heart with God's strength, and your perception with God's truth. Breakthrough follows a mechanism, and this mechanism begins with displacement. Once you release the battle and make space for God to enter, His presence begins reorganizing the inner architecture of your thoughts and emotions. The heart that once resisted begins softening. The mind that once spiraled begins stabilizing. The spirit that once felt crushed begins rising. You may not see anything shifting externally, but something internal is changing. This internal shift is the first stage of breakthrough. It is the quiet but decisive moment where God begins to work at the roots instead of the surface. Descartes believed that transformation begins when false ideas are removed, allowing truth to re-establish order. The breakthrough mechanism reflects this perfectly. God begins by exposing the beliefs that have been shaping your fear. He reveals the assumptions that have directed your decisions. He uncovers the emotional patterns that have kept you stuck. He identifies the internal resistance that has been blocking clarity. He reorders these elements one by one, not through force, but through illumination. Breakthrough is not an explosion. It is a reconstruction. As this reconstruction unfolds, one of the first signs of breakthrough appears. Clarity returns. Not full clarity, but the kind that brings light to one step at a time. Clarity does not shout. It guides. It begins by removing the confusion that once made everything feel distorted. It calms the internal noise enough for you to recognize what is true. It brings order to scattered thoughts and steadiness to reactive emotions. Clarity becomes the first evidence that breakthrough is already underway, even if the battlefield around you looks unchanged. Another sign of breakthrough is the easing of internal pressure. The weight you have been carrying begins to feel lighter, not because the situation has changed, but because God has taken his rightful place within it. The pressure you felt was the result of misalignment. The relief you feel is the result of surrender. Pressure leaves when God enters. It leaves when your heart stops functioning as the sole defender of its own survival. This internal easing is not imaginary. It is the restructuring of your spiritual center. As breakthrough deepens, courage begins to rise. Not loud courage, not impulsive courage, but a steady, grounded courage that grows as you realize you are no longer fighting alone. This courage is not emotional. It is structural. It becomes part of the foundation God is rebuilding inside you. It strengthens your ability to move. It sharpens your perception. It steadies your breathing. It turns hesitation into direction. Courage is the visible sign that breakthrough has anchored itself within you. Breakthrough also appears in the alignment of timing. What once felt blocked begins to open. What once felt delayed begins to make sense. What once felt chaotic begins to show pattern. God's timing reveals itself through alignment. Conversations fall into place. Opportunities emerge that were invisible before. Insights arrive at moments when you need them most. Doors that remained shut begin to respond. None of this happens randomly. It happens because the inner world has been corrected, allowing you to cooperate with the timing God had prepared all along. Another part of the breakthrough mechanism is the restoration of spiritual sensitivity. When the heart is overwhelmed, it becomes desensitized. When the mind is overloaded, it cannot perceive divine nudges. When emotions are chaotic, subtle guidance is missed. But when God reorganizes your inner structure, your ability to sense his direction becomes sharp again. You begin noticing the small shifts in your spirit. You discern peace more quickly. You recognize warning signs with greater accuracy. You feel when God is guiding you forward and when he is telling you to wait. Sensitivity becomes restoration. The final stage of the breakthrough mechanism is confidence in God's movement. You begin trusting the unseen because you feel the inner transformation he has already produced. You stop questioning whether he is working because you recognize the evidence within yourself. Breakthrough stops being something you hope for and becomes something you walk in. It becomes a posture, a perspective, a new way of interpreting your life. You realize breakthrough is not an event you wait for. It is a reality you enter as soon as your heart aligns with God's presence. This mechanism prepares you for the next truth. Breakthrough is not complete until it transforms how you live. And once God repositions your inner world, your entire life begins to shift accordingly. The repositioned life. When breakthrough begins within you, life does not return to what it was. Breakthrough repositions you. It shifts the way you see the world, the way you interpret challenges, and the way you respond to pressure. The repositioned life is not defined by external change at first. It is defined by internal realignment. It begins when the heart stops fighting from a place of fear and begins moving from a place of divine clarity. A repositioned life is not a life free from battles. It is a life where battles no longer define your identity or dictate your emotional stability. Repositioning begins with perception. Once God has entered the space where fear once ruled, you begin to interpret reality differently. A problem that once felt like a threat now appears as an opportunity for God to reveal His strength. A delay that once frustrated you now becomes a sign of divine pacing. A closed door that once felt like rejection now appears as protection. Your perception shifts from scarcity to sufficiency, from fear to trust, from isolation to partnership. This perception shift is not superficial. It is structural. It alters the framework through which you understand everything around you. Descartes believed that true transformation begins when the mind questions the assumptions that once felt absolute. The repositioned life reflects this perfectly. You begin questioning the thoughts that once controlled you. You question the fear that once dictated your reactions. You question the pressure that once shaped your decisions. Instead of accepting internal chaos as truth, you now measure it against the clarity God has established within you. This creates a disciplined mind, a mind capable of distinguishing between imagined threats and true guidance. As perception shifts, emotions begin to stabilize. Fear loses its authority. Panic loses momentum. Anxiety loses influence. The emotional storms that once overwhelmed you become manageable because your inner world is no longer shaped by instability. Stability is not the absence of emotion. It is the strengthening of the foundation beneath emotion. God becomes that foundation. He becomes the anchor that holds you steady even when circumstances press against you. The repositioned life is steady because its stability does not depend on external calm. It depends on internal order. Repositioning also affects decisions. A heart aligned with God no longer reacts impulsively. It responds intentionally. You begin making choices from peace rather than pressure. You move when God strengthens conviction, and you pause when He withdraws peace. Decisions become guided, not forced. You recognize when opportunities are aligned with God's timing and when they are distractions disguised as progress. The repositioned life thinks before moving, listens before acting, and discerns before committing. It is not slow. It is deliberate. It is directed. Another dimension of repositioning is relational awareness. You begin to see people differently. You recognize who fuels your peace and who drains it. You discern who God is sending into your life and who is pulling you away from alignment. You sense the difference between relationships that refine you and relationships that confuse you. The repositioned life develops sensitivity to the spiritual dynamics around connections. You no longer tolerate what weakens your clarity. You no longer cling to what God is removing. You no longer chase what was only meant to be seasonal. You protect your alignment because you understand how costly misalignment once was. Repositioning also awakens expectancy. You stop waiting for something to go wrong and start expecting God to move. You stop preparing for disappointment and start preparing for direction. You stop rehearsing worst-case scenarios and start anticipating breakthrough. This expectancy is not naive. It is born from the inner evidence of God's work. When you feel the internal restructuring that surrender has created, you cannot help but expect external change to follow. Expectancy becomes a natural outcome of transformation. The repositioned life is marked by clarity, steadiness, and alignment. But above all, it is marked by partnership. You no longer walk ahead of God. You no longer lag behind Him. You walk with Him. You trust His pace. You follow His signals. You yield to His timing. You no longer carry battles in your own strength because you understand the cost of doing so. You allow Him to lead, and in that leading, the path becomes illuminated in ways you could never have engineered alone. This repositioned life is the final preparation for the last truth you must embrace. Breakthrough is not complete until courage rises within you. compelling you to live the life God has restored from the inside out. The courage that rises after surrender. Courage does not enter the heart at the beginning of the battle. Courage enters after surrender. It rises in the space that becomes available once fear loses its position. It is not loud, reckless, or impulsive. It is steady, deliberate, and deeply rooted in the awareness that you are no longer fighting alone. Courage is not the absence of fear. It is the reordering of your inner world to the point where fear no longer governs your decisions. The moment God takes his place at the center of your heart, courage begins forming with a strength that does not depend on emotion, but on truth. There is a misconception that courage is something you must generate. But true courage is not self-produced. True courage is bestowed. It emerges from surrender because surrender removes the weight that crushed your ability to move. Courage appears when the heart stops carrying responsibilities that never belonged to it. The mind stops wrestling with outcomes it cannot control. The emotions stop spiraling under the pressure of imagined futures. When this internal fight ceases, courage rises naturally. God becomes the anchor, and from that anchor, you gain the ability to step forward without collapsing. Descartes taught that clarity leads to certainty, and certainty leads to action. The courage that rises after surrender follows this same reasoning. Once God reorganizes your thoughts and reveals truth, the uncertainty that once paralyzed you begins to dissolve. Your internal landscape shifts from confusion to coherence. You begin to understand your circumstances not as threats, but as context where God is actively working. This clarity becomes the birthplace of courage. You move not because the path is easy, but because the path is illuminated by truth. Courage after surrender also changes the way you perceive risk. Before surrender, every step felt dangerous because you assumed you were responsible for every outcome. After surrender, risk becomes reframed. It is no longer something that threatens you. It becomes something that invites you. You begin recognizing that God prepares the step before you take it. You understand that a closed door is not punishment. It is redirection. A delayed answer is not abandonment. It is timing. A difficult moment is not a sign of defeat. It is an anchor point where your courage grows stronger. As courage rises, the internal dialogue shifts. The questions that once fueled fear begin losing their influence. Questions shaped by self-doubt weaken. Questions shaped by anxiety fade. Questions shaped by past wounds stop directing your expectations. In their place, new questions emerge. What is God preparing? What is God revealing? What step is God strengthening me to take? These questions are not driven by insecurity. They are driven by alignment. They signal that your heart is no longer analyzing life through fear, but through faith. Courage also affects your physical presence. Your breathing becomes steadier. Your body stops bracing for impact. Your chest feels less tight. Your movements become purposeful rather than hesitant. This physical shift is not imagined. It is the evidence of internal order manifesting externally. The body reacts to the state of the heart, and when God restores the heart, courage influences the entire frame. You stand differently. You think differently. You move differently. The same circumstances that once overwhelmed you now become moments where your strength feels renewed. One of the most powerful aspects of courage after surrender is the return of spiritual authority. Fear steals authority. It weakens conviction. It distorts judgment. But when God occupies the space fear once held, your spiritual authority intensifies. You begin recognizing that you are not navigating life as a fragile being, but as someone strengthened by divine presence. You approach decisions with confidence. You confront challenges with steadiness. You speak truth with boldness. This authority is not pride. It is partnership. It is the result of aligning your will with God's will. Courage after surrender is not temporary. It does not fade when circumstances shift. It lasts because it is rooted in transformation rather than emotion. It is the courage that comes from experiencing God's involvement in the depths of your inner world. Once you witness what He does internally, you become confident in what He can do externally. This confidence sustains movement. It sustains obedience. It sustains resilience. This rising courage prepares you for the final truth. Breakthrough is not complete until courage becomes the force that propels you into the next stage God has prepared. And in the final chapter, that truth becomes the closing seal on everything this journey has awakened within you. The breakthrough life ahead. A breakthrough is not merely a moment of relief. It is a transition into a new way of living. Once you have surrendered the battles that drained you, once God has restructured the patterns that held you, once courage has risen from within, your life enters a different landscape. This landscape is not defined by perfection or the absence of pressure. It is defined by clarity, strength, and stability that were not present before. The breakthrough life is a life where you no longer move from fear, but from conviction. You no longer react from anxiety, but from discernment. You no longer live under the weight of imagined outcomes, but under the certainty that God is actively shaping your path. The breakthrough life begins with internal memory. You remember the place where you surrendered. You remember the weight that lifted. You remember the moment clarity returned. You remember how God entered the space that fear once controlled. These memories become more than emotional experiences. They become spiritual anchors. They remind you that God's presence is not theoretical. It is practical. It is involved. It is available. And each memory reinforces the truth that you are not the same person you were before the battle began. Descartes taught that the mind must return to what is known with certainty in order to build a new foundation. In the breakthrough life, your certainty is no longer built on your abilities, your strategies, or your logic alone. Your certainty is built on the evidence of what God has already done within you. This becomes the foundation for every new step you take. You think differently because you trust differently. You move differently because you perceive differently. Your inner world no longer collapses under uncertainty because it has been rebuilt on truth rather than fear. As you walk into this new life, the way you interpret resistance changes. Resistance no longer signals defeat, it signals growth. It reveals where God is strengthening areas that once remained fragile. You no longer panic when something feels difficult. You evaluate. You discern. You inquire. You watch for God's movement instead of assuming abandonment. In this new life, pressure becomes a place of partnership instead of dread. You understand that God shapes resilience through challenge and depth through discomfort. Nothing you face is meaningless. Everything you face becomes material God uses for expansion. The breakthrough life also transforms your relationship with timing. You no longer chase moments that are not aligned. You no longer force doors that resist opening. You no longer cling to opportunities that weaken your peace. You recognize timing as a form of divine intelligence. When God delays, it is intentional. When God accelerates, it is purposeful. When God redirects, it is protection. This awareness removes the anxiety that once accompanied every decision. You begin living with a rhythm that matches the pace of divine guidance, rather than the urgency of fear. Another dimension of the breakthrough life is the steadiness it creates. Steadiness does not mean you will never feel pressure again. It means pressure no longer determines your posture. Steadiness is the result of alignment. It is the evidence that your center is anchored in something greater than uncertainty. You wake with stability. You move with confidence. You speak with clarity. You choose with intention. You endure with patience. This steadiness becomes a testimony to others, not because your life is perfect, but because your spirit no longer fractures under stress. The breakthrough life shifts the way you carry yourself. You walk with the awareness that God is not only with you, but ahead of you. You no longer take steps hoping to avoid danger. You take steps trusting that God is preparing everything you cannot yet see. You no longer enter situations expecting collapse. You enter prepared for growth. You no longer fear the unknown. You understand that the unknown is the territory where God reveals what He has prepared. This transforms hesitation into expectation and doubt into movement. One of the most profound elements of the breakthrough life is the renewal of purpose. Purpose that was once buried under pressure begins to rise. Dreams that were once silenced by fear begin to breathe again. Strength that once lay dormant becomes active. You recognize that the battle you endured was not a detour. It was preparation. It shaped you, deepened you, and positioned you for what comes next. Breakthrough becomes not only something you experienced, but something you embody. It becomes the lens through which you interpret your future. A breakthrough is not the end of a struggle. It is the beginning of a different existence. You step forward with a heart that is no longer divided, a mind that is no longer overwhelmed, and a spirit that is no longer confined by fear. You carry within you the evidence of transformation, the courage to advance, and the certainty that God is guiding every step of this new chapter in your life.